Computer. And welcome everyone to I think this is the first, I know there's more scheduled after this, but I believe we're the first Zoom demo session for the upcoming fall classes. And I'll introduce myself and then I'll kind of walk you through the plan for today and we'll go from there. So my name is Derek Stewart and I teach English at Midlands Tech. I've been teaching English 101 and English 102 and a couple other English classes for I think this is the start of my 8th year now, and I've been teaching Zoom classes since the spring as well. And I'll be teaching a couple of them in the fall. And the goal for today, the plan for today is to walk through what a typical Zoom class would look like, at least a typical English Zoom class. I don't know what math classes are going to look like, and I mean, I can guess, but I don't know. And just to show you how to participate in these classes. And I know not all of you are students. Some of you are not students, but I'm going to treat you all like students today just for the sake of my own ease of audience communication. So even if you're not, just pretend to be for a second. And I know some of you have some familiarity with Zoom, but I'm going to treat everybody kind of like a beginner here. So my goal is anybody who has not used Zoom to participate in a class or participate in any sort of virtual meeting, just to say, well, here's how it works. And so one of the best things you can do here as I start is just to sort of explore the options. The control bar, sometimes it pops up down at the bottom of the screen. It tends to pop up at the top of my screen when I'm running a meeting, but I know when I've been a participant, it tends to pop up down at the bottom. And the tools on that are just, it's worth it to play around. You can mute your audio and you can mute your video there. And I strongly encourage you to learn the mute audio button. Mute your microphone. That's the #1 rule of good Zoom etiquette, especially in a class when we've got 20 or 25 people. One person who leaves their microphone unmuted and then starts typing an email because they got distracted, or their kids, if you're like me, your kids come running into the room or your dog starts barking, it can disrupt the whole class. And I'm sure y'all know that, y'all have seen that. There's lots of funny videos online of stuff like that happening now because it's the world we live in. So muting your microphone, and most of your teachers will set your microphone to be automatically muted, but if you want to talk, if you need to talk, don't hesitate to unmute it. But the general practice is keep it muted, keep it from distracting other people. A lot of times students will mute their videos. Some teachers require them to, some teachers require them not to. It's going to be up to the individual instructor usually. I usually let my students mute their videos unless we're starting to have a class-wide discussion. A lot of times if you have a slow internet connection, muting your video can help. And so you're welcome to keep your video muted or not, it's your call. One of the best things I found with videos is and I'm not sure if you can do it while I'm sharing my screen here like this while you're looking at this picture, but let me stop the sharing and I'll show you this. When it's just people talking, there should be a button up near the top that lets you decide if you're going to have a gallery view, which will spread out everybody on the screen, or if you are going to have a speaker view, which will switch the camera back and forth from one speaker to another. And I have strongly decided that I prefer the gallery view. It shows everybody all at once. And the Zoom algorithm is not quite good at picking up who's speaking when and who's supposed to be speaking. And so it sometimes will pause on one person who tapped their desk and they sit there looking awkward while somebody else is supposed to be speaking. If you like those sorts of awkward encounters, you can leave it on the speaker view. I really like the gallery view though. That's my preference. And so again, just like playing with the buttons is what I tell my students they always need to do when they're using any sort of new digital technology. Don't be scared you're going to break something or delete something or ruin your grade or something like that. It's useful and it's necessary just to figure out how to work things. 2 other buttons and then I'll be done. Actually, it's really just one. It's the chat button down on the bottom or up on the top of your screen, wherever the control bar is. That chat window is a really helpful tool that I use in all of my classes. Most of my classes consider me sitting here talking to people, going through some sort of complicated theory, some complicated principle, looking at a research source. And I just leave the chat window open and I tell my students, if you have a question, type it. A lot of teachers will do that. as just a simple way to, it beats raising your hand and pausing, which is kind of difficult to do in Zoom. There is a way, I'll show you that. But I just tell my students, type a question in the chat. Every now and then, if I've missed it, I'll scroll back up and make sure I haven't left anybody hanging. So the chat feature is one, it's very easy to send to everybody in the class. It's also very easy to send to just me, just the instructor. Don't abuse the privilege and start a one-on-one chat with other students. I've seen that happen. That's no good. The last button you should use, the last good button on the control panel, is the reactions button. You can use this reactions button to, sometimes I ask my students, just give me a thumbs up. And if you click on the reactions button, you can see there's a thumbs up there. I say, is everybody with me? Give me a thumbs up, and everybody can give me a thumbs up. There's a similar button. I get these two jumbled together in my head. There's a similar button under, I think it's under the participations, or maybe it's under the, it might be under the reactions for y'all, where you can raise your hand. I don't think I can raise my hand as the host. There's somebody raising their hand. Chanel's raising her hand. You can do it in the, it's in the participants menu. If you click on the participants button, you'll see your name and you can raise your hand. That's another way you can ask questions in your classes. I prefer just type something. It keeps it there. I don't have to pause. You don't have to get on camera. A lot of my students are shy to get on camera. You can just type something and we'll answer it, and you can type back to me. Some of your instructors you'll find, if you're in my class, I tend to adapt to my students. If you're in other classes, they might have more sophisticated set rules saying, okay, if you have a question, be sure to use this feature. If you have a problem, do it this way. But I think we'll all get to figure this out together. Your instructors are in a nice boat with you, and that they haven't figured this all out either. At least I know I haven't. So there's Zoom. One of the best things you can do that's really not on Zoom, that I've told all of my students, it's not a feature of Zoom, but it goes with it, is buy a decent headset. That made my life much, much easier. A headset with a microphone, and I highly recommend, I bought this one off Amazon for like 20 bucks, but I'll show you. It's got this little button right here where I can mute my microphone and I can change the volume up. It's fantastic because I like to drink coffee while I teach, and so I can mute myself, take a sip of my coffee, and you all don't get to hear me slurping, which would be unpleasant. Or if I have a cough or something. So I like a good headset. It makes your life easier, especially if you've got distractions around. All right, so let's talk about how a class would work. There's the intro, the crash course in Zoom. I've only got a 10 or 15 minutes left, so I'm not gonna give you a gigantic demonstration. I'm not gonna go through a whole lesson. But in general, what my classes look like is I say, welcome everybody. I ask people to type any questions they have in chat. I take roll. I've experimented with different ways of doing that. And then once we get going, I open up, there's another share screen feature. I open up Zoom and I use the whiteboard. So Zoom has this, it's a really fantastic tool where I simply lay out, all right, here's our goals for the day. And I like this whiteboard because I can type a whole lot faster than I can write on a regular whiteboard. And I list out what we're going to do. And then I say, all right, so let's start talking about this. Our goals for our class today, I want to give you a demonstration just of how this would look in my class, is our goals would be to discuss the writing process. This is a lesson that I give at the beginning of every semester. It's on day 1 or day 2 in almost all of my classes, especially in English 101, which a lot of y'all will be in for the fall. And what we talk about is how in any task, there is a process for accomplishing it. And writing is a task. It's not just a body of knowledge. And in order to become a good writer, like a person who's good at any task, you have to be able to break down the process that produces the product, right? You can't expect yourself to be a good mechanic if you don't have a process for doing the necessary tasks on your car, changing the oil or balancing the tires or whatever. You've got a series of steps, right? And writing is no different. And so students who come to my class, a lot of times they think of writing as one single act. I sit down and I type a paper, and the goal is to break that up and make it much more complex. So always in my class, I say, listen, if we're going to talk about writing, we got to break it down into the process. And the process is threefold. It's a simple lesson, right? When you're talking about writing, there's the pre-writing process, or the pre-writing, let's call it the pre-writing stage in the process. This is the first. Not always. It's a little wrong. I'll explain what I mean in a second. It's a little wrong to call it the first. But pre-writing happens when you're getting your thoughts, when you're gathering your thoughts. It's pre-writing. That doesn't mean you're not typing or you're not putting pen on paper. Sometimes you're doing that. But it's anything you do to collect your thoughts and to get yourself organized. So it can be something really bizarre. It can be something like taking a walk, for example. Walking is pre-writing for many people. For many, many people, conversations are pre-writing. They go to their roommate and they say, I've got this stupid paper in my stupid English class and I don't know what I'm going to do. And they get their ideas flowing by complaining about it sometimes. Not always, but sometimes. Pre-writing happens when you're reading. It happens when you're outlining. So this is one of those places where you would be putting pen on paper or typing on your computer, right? So the pre-writing name is a little false there. But you're outlining or you're charting, or people make, what do they call them? Mind maps or bubble graphs. There's all sorts of processes people get taught or people develop to get their thoughts organized, right? Pre-writing is anytime you're doing that. And the key distinction here, we'll put this in parentheses here. The key distinction when you're pre-writing is that there's no real audience. This is what I always tell my students. You're pre-writing if you don't imagine anybody else besides yourself reading it. You're pre-writing. Drafting is the next stage. So the writing process starts with pre-writing usually, and then it goes to drafting. And drafting is simple. Drafting is when you sit down and you're typing or writing and you have an audience. So you imagine somebody is going to read this. Somebody is going to get the communication that I'm trying to put on paper here. That's when you switched into the drafting mode. And one of the best things that almost all of my students need to do, one of the best things they can do is they can say, okay, here I am switching from pre-writing to drafting. A lot of times they don't recognize that switch in their own process. And that's honestly a big breakthrough for most of my students. So there's pre-writing, there's drafting, and then there's revision. These are the big three. Revision is it's re-seeing, revision, right? It's re-seeing, it's re-looking at, it's looking again, it's going back through and making changes. It's cutting, it's adding, it's rewriting, all those things. Revision is not too complicated for many people to understand. It's taking things and fixing sometimes, but also just changing. A lot of my students, when they think of revision, they think, oh, I've left out a comma here. I've got to add a comma, when really revision is more like, this sentence doesn't make much sense. I need to change the way I've written this. I need to change what it says. So, all right, that's the abbreviated version of this lesson. There's two more points I always make with it, and I'll do this just to show you kind of how the whiteboard tends to work. Again, I like this whiteboard. So there's two more points that I tend to make about the writing process. So, and they apply to all three stages of it. And this is the way I like to do this, right? Draw a line here. This applies to everything. The writing process is, first of all, it's individual. Meaning, what works for me is not going to work for you. Everybody develops their own writing process. Now we're going to talk about, if you're in my class, we're going to talk about lots of different methods for pre-writing, lots of different strategies for revising, lots of different rules for drafting. But what you have to do as a student is say, how do I improve my process? How do I take what is undoubtedly an immature process right now, a baby process, a beginner's process, and how do I turn that into a mature process, an adult process? So what works for me will not work for you, not always. And secondly, I love this word. This is my favorite word. It's recursive. It's an individual process. It applies to everybody uniquely, and it's recursive, meaning it's not linear. A recursive process is like braiding hair. It's a process that loops back in on itself over and over and goes in circles and spirals. So it's not like I start with pre-writing and then I'm done with that, and then I go to drafting and then I'm done with that, and then I go to revision, then I'm done with that. Writers, if you study what they do, they're switching back and forth between these tasks, sometimes second to second, moment to moment, as they produce certain documents. And so it's not like you have to be checked one off. You have to have checked one off and then you can move on to the next one. So this is what I teach my classes. And y'all aren't in an English class yet, so I won't keep talking about this, but I could. This is what I teach my classes on day 2, right? And if you were in my Zoom class, this is what you'd see. And some things to realize about Zoom. All right, so while we're going through this, right, you'll have the chat box open. And if you get confused, you say, now, wait a minute, would such and such count as pre-writing? And I can say yes or no. But also a thing to realize about Zoom is it's recording this meeting most of the time. So it's a really good idea to be taking notes just to cement things into your mind. But also, if you miss a class, let's say, your kid does come running into the room and he's got a bloody nose and you got to go deal with that. Zoom has, it records not just the audio and the video, but it records the screen share. So you could go back and pull up my whiteboard here and study it and figure out what you missed. It'll automatically do that. So if your class gets interrupted or if you miss a class, there should be a way for you to go back and access the missed classes. And that's a lot of times a really good boon for students, a really good backup plan. Because again, we're all in this weird kind of Zoom virtual space, and it's not always as planned and as polished as we'd like it to be. A couple other things to realize about Zoom, and this is one you might, I bet some of y'all noticed this as you were listening to me, especially those of you who aren't going to be students in the fall. There's a real temptation to just go up and click on open a new tab in my browser and distract oneself with pulling up Facebook or something like that. And I found consistently for my students in Zoom classes, the fight against that temptation is one of the biggest skills that they need to develop. And for those of you coming up for the fall, one of the best things you can start to do is train yourself to fight that impulse. If whether you're on your phone or a computer, not to slide over to a new tab, not to open up a new window and listen half-heartedly in the background, because there's lots of studies that show we don't multitask well, and you think you're listening, but you're not. And that's one of the reasons as well your instructors might require you to keep your camera on. They can see if you've slid over to some other window. So we'll talk about this. If you're in my class, we'd discuss the writing process some more. And then after talking about that, we'd go on to some activities. A lot of those activities would be things like going and participating in a discussion board. You'll have a companion online classroom called Desire to Learn, or D2L. And a lot of times we'll talk about a concept in my class and then say, all right, let's go to the discussion board and create a thread and talk about what would your writing process look like right now and what would be the weak points. And I'd ask you to write a paragraph or two. How do you plan on improving it? Your instructor might also in Zoom, and I'm not going to do this today, but it's possible to create breakout rooms and send everybody who's a participant in a meeting off to a small Zoom meeting where it'd just be you and 3 or 4 other students and say, okay, I want you to discuss your writing process. What does it look like? How does it work right now when you write a paper? And then your instructor would call you back into the main room. So the classes that I've been teaching and the classes I've participated in and talked to my fellow instructors about, that tends to be sort of the pattern there. We'll introduce a concept, we'll talk about it. I'll give you my thoughts. We'll discuss some readings that you might have done about it. And then I'll send you on your way to practice it or to solidify it through some discussion board post or small writing assignment or perhaps a Zoom breakout room. And we'll continue to work. As we do those little activities, we'll always be working towards some larger assignment that's looming in the future, some big research paper that you have to write. So that's about as much as I can give you. Hey, look, I was supposed to be 20 minutes. I'm right at 20 minutes. I'm getting pretty good at this sort of thing, huh? That's the general overview of what a class would look like. I wanted to give the last 10 minutes here for any questions at all about any aspect of what I was showing you today, or questions about Zoom, questions about Midlands Tech. We've got people in the chat who can answer pretty much any question you can come up with. So if there are questions, feel free to type them. If you don't want to unmute your microphone, type them in the chat. Feel free to unmute your microphone in your video and ask them. Jesse said, thank you. This has been very helpful. I'm glad, Jesse. I hope that was. There's another skill. I said one of the skills is you have to fight that impulse to get distracted. Another one is you have to be a little bit okay with these pauses that happen in Zoom meetings. Drew, what kind of writing support do we offer at the college? That's a great question. So we'll have, I always tell my students, start with me, start with your instructor. You'll have access to my email and my phone, and you'll have access to me through online communication. But the college also has resources from tutor.com where, say it's midnight and you're working on a paper for the next day, right? Tutor.com has 24/7 online tutoring that you can go and you can work with the tutors there. There's a link to that from the, it's the student resources page, I think, on the Midlands Tech homepage. Could I show you what a breakout looks like? Ooh, that's risky. I've never used breakout sessions. I've been a part of them. I don't know if I can do them right now. I think I have to set them up ahead of time. I think that's right. So I can't. If you want to see a breakout session, I'll have to defer you to maybe one of the other Zoom demos. Other questions, other concerns? Have I gotten any feedback from my students about virtual classes? Yes, I got some interesting feedback from my students about virtual classes. In the spring, so a lot of the feedback I got, in the spring, I taught one class that started as virtual. And so when we shut down after spring break, Midlands Tech pretty much said, nope, nobody's coming back from spring break. We're all going to virtual classes. So my one class had been virtual from January. That was no big deal. They got to take a week off actually as the college reorganized, and they were fine. The students who switched in the middle were very, very nervous. However, the students that started on ground and then spring break happened and then they realized they weren't coming back in person and they were coming back through Zoom. They, you could tell they were really nervous, and there was a lot of emails where I was hand holding and saying, you're going to be okay. Here's how it's going to work, and here's what we're going to do. But you would be amazed by the end of that, by the end of the semester. The first couple of weeks were a little rough, and I stumbled around in Zoom and shared the wrong screen a couple of times and forgot to save it and upload it to the D2L afterwards. But once we all kind of got our feet under ourselves, there were a lot of students who really liked it. They, like I had one student who, as COVID hit, he had to make some extra money and he started walking dogs. And he would attend the class every afternoon while on a dog walk. He'd be on his phone and we'd say, hey, and he'd say, look who I'm walking today. And he'd flip his phone around and show us the dogs that were on the leashes in front of him. And so it didn't get in his way. I got two people who with their hands up, Nicole and Latoya. Nicole's first on my list. Did you have a question?
I didn't. I was just testing
Okay.
that up feature. Sorry.
That's all right. I'm glad it works. Latoya, did you have a question?
The same thing. I was testing.
Okay. Wanted to make sure. I don't know. Oh, you can't. I can lower your hand. Look at this. Your question has been answered. That's I don't know how long y'all have had your hands up. That's one of the reasons I tell my students to type something in the chat. It's easy to miss the little blue hand. Well, if there are any more questions, especially if there are any more questions with English, I'm going to go ahead and type my email address in here. Any of y'all are welcome to email me about any aspect of Zoom. And if I can't answer your question, if it's about English, I can answer your question. But if I can't, you're welcome to, I can find out who can. I'm pretty good at doing stuff like that. Oh, Brad asked, how do you handle students with technical issues? That's a good question. Case by case basis. And in the spring, it was very much, oops, I typed that to the wrong person. I'm sorry. Um, in the spring, it was very much a matter of grace and mercy and understanding and all sorts of necessary accommodations. And I imagine that in the fall, it's going to be the same way. In the fall, um, because some parents don't even know how their kids are going to school yet, if they have kids. Some students, their jobs are up in the air. I imagine there's going to be a lot of need for flexibility in terms like attendance and late work and technical issues. It's going to be it's just going to be absolutely necessary to meet students where they are. And so that's usually my goal. I never had a student who seemed to abuse that policy in the spring. I'm not sure if that'll happen or not in the fall. Who I was trying to be as understanding as I could. I never had a student who seemed to really take advantage of that. So I almost always, I would post meetings up on D2L afterwards. I would email with students who were missing something and missing work or couldn't have attended the class. That's usually my go-to, is to say, if you can't join the class, go watch the meeting. It'll be posted up right after class is over, or send me an email and I'll work with you to make sure you got what you need. That was usually enough to solve it. Alrighty. If there are any more questions, I'll be happy to hang around and answer them. Otherwise, I appreciate you all being here and have a happy week.